I'm back. Well, here we are. This is part one of a two-part video, and it's talking about PreSonus audio box in section 2. But here in part one, we've got actually Paul White, who was the editor-in-chief, that is, from Sound on Sound, and he did a question and answer section, and I thought it was quite interesting to listen to. So yeah, here's the video. He's coming up anytime soon, actually. This was recorded at Music Store Pro, which is a local music store in the area where I live in England. And it was a bit dark on his face for some of the time. They had this backlighting. And some of the audio goes a little bit quiet from the questions, but you get all the answers anyway out of Paul. And very good. Here he is. Till next time.
Okay, so
Right, it's not about a specific product, but the fact is, when you're sitting there and you're making your music and you've got your mix going and done all that stuff for years upon years upon years, you end up with a CD. But the fact is, when you did all that, everything you did was subjective.
yes,
Right, how do you end up with a mix that isn't subjective?
all mixes are subjective.
Yeah, well, the problem is...
music is art.
Yeah.
You know, and if a pickled cow or a brick with a hole in it is art, then so is anything you produce.
So we could go and take one of these great engineers and say, well, that's not very good, is it?
You could say
On
that,
that
but
basis.
as long as it's the way you intended it to be, then it's your art. That's okay. What's frustrating is when you intend it to be something and it turns out to be something else.
Right.
And the best way you can make sure it's right is to check it on a great number of speakers.
Right.
As we were saying yesterday to the guys, one of the mistakes is to get 3 different sets of monitors in the same room, and then you make sure it sounds right on all those monitors. But what you haven't taken into account then is that the room acoustics are the same for all 3 sets of monitors, so any room problems will still be reflected in what you hear. So take it down to your granny's house and listen to it on a Amstrad Hi-Fi, that kind of thing. Listen to it in the car, certainly on good headphones, put it on your iPod, listen to it on earbuds, and if it satisfies all those different formats, then you can be fairly confident that it's going to be good.
Sorry.
No, you go first.
What if you do that and you've got all these different platforms or whatever, and you've tried it on your phone and on something else, and on just one of them it's not really sounding that good, but it is on the others? How would you tackle that?
You try to identify what was different about that particular platform.
Yeah.
The biggest difference is that some platforms don't reproduce a lot of bass.
Yeah.
If it's a small hi-fi system, it's not going to hear what the bottom octave is about, and it's still got to sound good on there. If it doesn't, it probably means that your bass frequencies are okay lower down, but there's nothing in the lower mid to kind of satisfy the ears in that mid-range area that a transistor radio might pick up.
Yeah.
So you probably look at that too. Apart from that, it should translate quite well because headphones give you the full spectrum,
Yeah.
so you should be able to hear absolutely everything on headphones. The other trick I do is, of course, get the mix playing and then walk outside the door and listen from in the corridor. And suddenly you can hear the balance as it really is without being swamped with detail. And suddenly that hi-hat that you thought was okay is actually 10 dBs too loud. And then you come back in, turn it down, go back outside again and have another listen. And that, I thought I'd invented that until I found every other producer does exactly the same thing. Yeah.
How would you recommend referencing against other tracks for like the lower end kind of stuff? So as in like the low frequencies?
Okay.
So if you're in like a less than ideal monitoring
There's 2 parts to that question, because if you're referencing to other material, it's already been mastered, where you're still at the mix stage and you haven't mastered it. So what I would tend to do is create a set of what I would call pseudo mastering plugins and stick them in. So that would be low ratio compression, maybe 1.2 to 1, and knock 5 dBs off the signal level, and then stick a couple of dBs of limiting on top of that. Save that as a preset and just put it in when you're doing your comparison with commercial material, and then reference the level on whatever you've got that produces the deepest bass.
Okay.
So headphones are a really good way again of doing that.
Okay. Do you use any kind of like visual stuff like frequency analysis or?
I do look at frequency analyzers specifically to show me stuff that's going on below the audio range, because that's eating up headroom and not actually doing anything. And when I'm mixing, I do tend to put low cut filters on just about everything that's not a bass instrument, sometimes for artistic reasons. I mean, as the guys were saying, with an acoustic guitar you might want to squeeze out all the bottom end and make it more chingy. But even with things like vocals, you know, there are no really low frequencies in a vocal other than popping or something that's very close to popping. And even with a pop shield, enough air gets through it that if you look on the spectrum analyzer, you'll see down at 20 and 30 hertz there's energy flapping up and down like that. So low cut filter it, but make sure that you're not damaging by cutting it too high frequency.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, cool.
Are there any plugins that you like personally swear by or like really go to, be them like third party or brought into a DAW?
There are not many that I'm that wedded to that I can't live without. I mean, I use Logic Pro because that's what I grew up with. So it's no reflection on these guys, but you know, I've been using that ever since Creator, and so I'm used to it. And it's plugins are all good enough for me to work with, to be honest. There are one or two extra ones I quite like. The Waves Vocal Rider is a clever thing because that actually automates your vocal level before you throw it into a compressor, which is something that might be worth expanding on, because you've told them what a compressor is, of course. It's the thing that turns down the loud bits, and then when you restore the gain it's turned up the quiet bits, so it's reducing the dynamic range. But what it does depends very much on the level of signal going into it, and if you've got a vocal that varies a lot and you stick it straight into a compressor, and you're going to find that you can hear a difference between when the compressor's working hard and when it's not, which again, for artistic reasons you might want that. But if you're just using the compressor as a way of evening up the levels, you might find that you get tonal changes then. So what I would always do is I always automate the levels first, manually, as best I can, to get the track sitting nice and evenly, and then go through a compressor. But of course you can't put the compressor straight into the insert slot on that channel, because that comes before the automation. So I send that channel to a bus and put the compressor in the bus, and that seems to work a lot better. Okay, good question. Okay, it's gone quiet.
Any cheap things you can think of to help deaden this recording in the living room, basically? So I'm trying to deaden it for acoustics and for recording vocal.
It depends what you're recording. Again, we touched on this yesterday, so these questions come up very often. But when you're recording vocals, you don't have to treat the entire room, you just have to treat the area around the microphone, because you have to control what it can hear. So what kind of microphone do you? If it's a cardioid pattern microphone, it can hear what's in front of it, and it's only slightly less sensitive at the sides. And then as you get more around the back of it, it gets less sensitive. So you can put something like a reflection filter around it, which will take care of all the angles that you need to, up to about 180 degrees, but it doesn't do anything for the front of the mic, which is actually the most sensitive. So you have to take care of that too, and that's where you have to worry about the reflections coming off the wall here and back over your shoulder into the mic. So you hang your duvet up, you know, take it off the drummer who's currently sleeping in the corner, hang it over a couple of mic stands, and that will intercept all that rubbish behind you, screen behind the mic. If you can't afford a screen, if you're a student, a couple of pillows or another duvet, it'll work fine. Much better than a badly made vocal booth, actually. And it is important to deaden the area when you're recording vocals, because as soon as you add compression it brings up all the lower sounds at the end of words, and that includes the room acoustic. And that's the problem a lot of people have. They say, well, my gear must be rubbish because I'm getting a boxy vocal sound, and it's not. If you buy more expensive gear, you'll just record your crap room in greater fidelity. Pretty obvious when you think about it, but you know, it's surprising only people fall into that gear trap. I mean, really, the gear that you can buy these days is so cheap and so good that you know you can make an album on your phone if you really had to. Certainly make one on an iPad. And I promised I wouldn't say garbage bland when I was talking about iPad. So you could use GarageBand and make an album on it, no trouble, if you had to. Yeah, so it's mostly about what goes into that microphone. Honestly, I mean, most of a good recording happens before the sound even gets to the mic. And that's what a lot of folks, certainly some of our readers, don't seem to realise, because they stick the mics wherever it says in the textbook. They don't experiment to find the sweet spot, and then they spend 3 weeks trying to sort it out with plugins. I mean, there's a wonderful thing we did in Wigan. We did a Studio SOS, you may have read about it about 3 or 4 years ago. We went up and we sent the guy in to make coffee and get his chocolate biscuits out, because that's what we always do. No chocolate hobnobs, no remix, that kind of thing. And we said, well, let's have a look at your mix. And the first thing I did is turn off all the plugins so I can see what he'd actually got. And he came running back out the kitchen. He says, "It's sounding better already. What have you done?" And I said, "I've just turned off all your plugins." You know, you just over-processed the thing, killed it to death, as it were. And the other thing he'd done, I hope none of you have fallen into this trap, is he'd stuck a preset compressor setting on just about everything because he'd heard that's what you do. But his audio was recorded at a sensible level, which is usually peaking at about -10 or even less, so you've got some headroom. And it was never even reaching the threshold setting for those compressors he put in there, because whoever designed those presets assumed that you were working with a really hot signal. And so they weren't actually doing anything because they were never being triggered. But you've got 10 of them sat there doing nothing. So if you're going to use presets, always look at the gain reduction meter on the compressor and adjust the threshold, because the guy who wrote that preset hasn't got the slightest clue about the dynamics or the volume of your recording. Yeah?
Does he?
Fair enough. Okay.
When I've been recording before, I've noticed that, you know what you keep saying about giving headroom.
Yeah.
So you've got to keep the frequency low. I've noticed that sometimes my volume comes through low, and I'm not getting the full volume that I want. And if I try and raise the volume, then I'm losing the headroom. Is there any way you can think of getting
I tend to leave about, as I say, about 10 dBs on all the tracks that I record, because when you mix them together, of course, the signal's louder than any one individual track, so it might come up at about -4 or -4 on the -5 on the master bus. You can always make up the gain there. You can bring it back up, especially if the last thing in line is a limiter. So with the limiter, you set a threshold, which I typically set at maybe -2 dB, and I shall tell you why in a moment. And then you turn up the input gain until the thing's just tickling the compressor or the limiter, and then it can't clip, and you've got the maximum volume. The reason I'd set it to -2 is that if you're doing an MP3 conversion, as most people are, the gain can actually increase slightly during that conversion process, and you might end up with clipping even if you'd started off with audio that wasn't clipped. So always leave that bit of a safety margin. But don't worry about having, the meter's only going halfway up when you're recording. With 24-bit audio, you've got headroom and noise capacity to spare.
Okay.
And the mix will sound cleaner, because a lot of the mix engines don't actually like it if you're running really hot. They have to struggle to kind of rescale everything and make it fit.
Yeah.
What do you think of the? I think it's RK Multimedia. They do I think it's ARC. Is it automatic room
I have
correction?
one. Yes.
What
This
do you
is
think
the
of it?
automatic room correction thing. I have mixed feelings about room correction software, because the problem is the room. It's not the monitors usually. A room is a resonant cavity, especially if it's a cube shape or a square shape even, so that the resonant frequencies between the opposite pairs of walls, they all kind of add up somewhere, and you get humps and bumps in the frequency response, and that causes energy to hang on. So if you put a kick drum into something that's very resonant, it's actually going to hang on after the event as the energy dies away, and you can't take that away with EQ. So the first thing to do is treat the room as best you can with acoustic treatment. Then, having said that, once you've done all that, then active room correction can help take out remaining peaks there which are annoying you. But it'll only work really well typically for one position in the room. The ARC system certainly will. You take maybe half a dozen or more measurements around the chair that you're going to sit in, and it averages them out, and it'll take out the peaks. What it can't do is put back the dips, because if you try to put back the dips, for example 20 dB dip, because of the bad acoustics, you try and put a 20 dB boost at that frequency, it's going to cause your monitors to hit the end stops, and they're going to sound horrible as well. So you have to try and ignore the dips and just try and cure the horrible boomy resonances. And you usually get 2 or 3. But if you're from Yorkshire and you're too mean to buy an ARC system, as some people here may be, put in a parametric equaliser and just sweep through until you find where they are, and create notches and try and adjust them. I do it while I'm running a staircase of sine wave tones. I just use a sampler and make it run through all the semitones and keep looping round around the bass reed. If one leaps out and it's too high, you can see where it is on the spectrum analyzer anyway. Pull down that frequency a bit, get it as level as possible, save that as a preset, and then stick that in when you're doing your mixing. But for heaven's sake, remember to take it out before you bounce the track, otherwise you'll have big holes in your bounce.
I have a Moto 828, so I can keep it runs through an EQ if you want it to, so I could potentially leave it on.
Well, it depends. If you've got sufficient control, you would need a multiband parametric to do it properly.
Yeah.
And most doors come with one anyway, so you can actually save it and just bypass it, switch it on and off. Put it in your default song in the master insert point.
Okay.
Yeah, it does work, but do everything you can first. Looking after the high frequencies is easy. Acoustic foam will do it, or again, if you're a cheapskate like me, you can get some rock wool and dress it up in fabric and hang that on the wall.
I have a treated room.
Yeah.
But there's still a few things going on in the low kind of.
You got any bass traps?
Yeah.
Okay, what sort of bass traps are they?
They're kind of like 6-inch deep RW45 I'm using at the moment.
Problem with that is
I've got some corner stuff.
Yeah.
And
it has to be quite deep to
piano
work.
noises. Yeah.
The thing we found that worked better than that for a lot less money was the loft insulation that comes in a big round pack.
Yeah.
And you just stand it in the corner. You don't even unwrap it.
That's what I have in the corners.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of
but
corner
the
wedges.
loft insulation's about big, so you get a roll. It's about 4 feet high and about that diameter. Put those in every corner, stack floor to ceiling, but leave it in the bag. Leave the price ticket on, because then you can sell it when your studio goes bust and you get some of your money back. Because it's like new, it's not been used. And it does work quite well. It looks horrible, so you can put a fabric screen in front of it. It should work fine. I mean, the other thing I'm intending to try but haven't done yet was I had the idea of making up some cardboard boxes, but in a triangular shape, like a big Toblerone shape, if you like, and fill that with the shredded foam that you can buy to fill pillows with, because that's about 10% of the cost of good foam. So if you fill that up and stick those in the corners, they should absorb low frequencies quite effectively.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's worth trying that. But if you tried everything else,
yeah.
Also try moving your monitors about a little bit. And when all that's failed, then do the active correction. But don't believe the adverts that say you don't need to treat your room at all. You can just stick any old crap in there and then equalise it. It doesn't work really, especially if you're recording in the same room, because if you speak into a microphone in that room, those room resonances are going to still affect what the microphone picks up. Yeah.
Thanks.
Does that help anybody else?
It's kind of a two-part question. Like, what do you personally think about like kind of streaming and how people can like stream music nowadays? Kind of like with the platform, as opposed to buying things, everything's kind of just like rental basis. Like, how have you found the kind of transition into that?
Streaming music or software? Is it?
Well, the streaming music, like how people consume it, the fact that people don't really buy albums as much anymore. It's more kind of just like services.
Whatever we think of it, it's what's happening. So we have to kind of address it and work with it. The tough part is making any money out of it, because streaming services are notoriously bad at paying you any great amount of money. It might be better to put it up on your own website first, or on one of the companies that host music for you, and see if you can actually sell it rather than have it streamed. But you know, if that fails, then get it streamed and just accept whatever you can get. But you always have to haggle for the best deal. I mean, personally, I don't think they're very good deals very often.
And the second question was kind of quality. Like, do you ever think, because at the moment, like, kind of MP3 is the standard format, but like with most kind of services, even with iTunes distributing music, it's still quite low quality. It's like 128, maybe 320 kilobits if like people like really pay attention to it. Do you ever think we'll get to like distributing lossless formats like FLAC as a standard, or do you think that'll still be?
I don't think it'll happen as a standard. I think it'll become an option. But for most people consuming audio, if the MP3 is above 220 kilobits stereo, it usually sounds acceptable. And if you've got it at 320 or whatever it is, it sounds very acceptable. So it's only the real hi-fi buffs are going to notice the difference, and then they'll pay extra to maybe download it as a WAV file, or even maybe as a 2496 WAV file, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, the world changes. That's the only thing you can rely on, is that there will be change. That's the only thing that's consistent. Not wanting to depress anybody. Anybody at the back who's been quiet with a question?
Do you have any tips on actually releasing music independently?
Not hugely, apart from things like the Apple Store, where you can put your music up on iTunes. It just has to meet certain criteria. The hardest part is marketing it, and you've got to exploit social media to the best of your advantage and just get the word out there. But the problem is, it's so easy to do that so many people have done it, it's hard to filter through and find the good music from the bad. So you just have to kind of build up this reputation. So if anyone finds out how to do it, let me know, because I've got a couple of albums I haven't put out there yet.
With everything sort of advancing recording technology and sort of making everything easier, do you ever find yourself going back to sort of more difficult methods just to keep your chops up?
Do you think technology is making everything too easy? So do I go back to doing it the hard way? Well, if I'm recording a band that actually plays really well together, I'll record it without a click track quite often, because I think click tracks can actually, on some styles of music, they can cramp it, because if you look at maybe a Pink Floyd track, the drum fills are not exactly a bar long at the same tempo, they might be 1.1 bars long or something. And it's difficult to anticipate that and program a click track to suit, so sometimes it's better just to let the band play, and it makes editing more difficult, but it's still perfectly doable. And that way I set myself these little challenges of editing tracks where people haven't played to a click. It's certainly doable. You can just treat your DAW like a tape recorder if you want. You know, just arm some tracks, record the song start to finish, punch in any dodgy bits that are there, stick on your basic effects, and you've got the same thing that we all had 20 years or 30 years ago. If you want to. But you know what it's like. Oh, I can just fix that as well. And that syllable's a little quiet, I can automate that, and maybe that S is too sharp. Put some EQ just on that S. So you can get really picky, but you have to reach a point during the project where you have to say, will it affect sales if I go any further? And usually the answer is no, because it's all about the song. I think that is quite often the mistake, you know. People like me who can't sing, I get someone else to sing, but there are people who are not very good. They think if they melodyne everything, it doesn't matter how bad their voice is, it'll sound okay. It doesn't. It sounds horrible. If you've got a horrible voice and you melodyne it, it'll just sound like a more in tune horrible voice. So have something worth recording is the first piece of advice, I think. And then take the time to move the microphones about. Don't just take what it says in the book, even my books, because my books will say move the mic about a bit. If you're doing the acoustic guitar, most books say stick it pointing somewhere where the neck meets the body, you know, but don't just put it there and leave it. Put your headphones on, and if it's you playing the guitar, move around a little bit, and up and down a bit, sideways a bit, and you'll find a sweet spot where it sounds better than the default, and that's the place to be. The trick is staying there and not doing that when you're playing. But good question. Any more good questions? So we've gone alarmingly quiet.
You said you've used like Logic. What was the first ever DAW like you ever used? Like the first thing you started recording?
It was Creator on the Atari, which was the forerunner of Logic. It was the old E-Magic people, or C-Lab as it was in those days it was called, and it was a very, very different thing. And we spent ages learning how to use this thing, and then suddenly out comes Logic, and it's, hey, wait a minute, this is totally, totally different. So I had to relearn it all again.
I guess you found that a lot, like the having to relearn the same thing. Because Logic, I mean, mainly the decks it changed a lot. But how did you find the transition going from like 9 to X?
The transition from Logic 9 to Logic 10, I found it a bit frustrating in some areas. Some of the black text on a grey background is difficult if you're working outdoors. I take my laptop on holiday and sit in the bar with a martini and try and write a song, you know. You can't see a bloody thing. You're there with a towel over your head trying to see what's on the screen. You tell the people at Apple, well, it's perfectly clear on one of our 4K displays in a black room. Well, of course it is, you know, but when you're sat in a bar, it's not so good. And the other thing is, they made it more logical by moving things into different menus. But if you'd already got used to where they were, it's like, where the hell have they put that? So there was about 2 weeks of, you know, somebody's put my cornflakes in the fridge kind of thing. But when you find it all, it actually does make more sense and is better. And they've done a lot of things that are sensible, and if you're a newcomer coming to it, I think it works better. But then if I was a newcomer coming to something, I'd probably take a look at this as well, because this does some things that Logic doesn't do. And it does most of the things I actually want it to do. In fact, most DAWs do lots of things you'll never do in your life. I probably only use 5% of Logic, and it does everything I want.
Is there any sort of affordable go-to all-round condenser mic you would recommend?
There's lots, but the thing is, if you're using it for vocals, it's more about finding one that suits your voice rather than recommending one based on its specification.
Yeah.
I mean, you may have read that Sound on Sound article we did a few years back where we had 16 mics ranging from £80 to, I think we got a C12, which is an unimaginable fortune, price of a small car. And then we had 4 different singers and a panel doing blind listening tests. And on one of the female singers, the cheapest mic, which was an Audio-Technica AT2020, actually came top. Somebody else was best on a a mic that probably cost a couple of £1,000. Everybody was different, so it's really a matter of trying to choose one. One of my favourite medium cost vocal mics is the MXL Genesis.
Yeah.
It's a really nice mic. It looks a bit blingy, it's kind of red and gold, you know.
Yeah.
Looks like it should be hanging off the side of a car in Escape from New York or something like that. But it's good, that works well. The new Aston mics work okay, but there are very few that are actual rubbish. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a long time since I've tried a rubbish microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's more about what it sounds like with your voice. A lot of it's instinctive, you know, if you know you've got a dull voice, you want a mic with quite a hefty presence peak. And if you've got a thin, weedy, scratchy, horrible voice, then maybe something a bit more mellifluous, something with a tube or a transformer in it to make it sound a bit softer.
Thank you.
Depends on your budget too.
Yeah, not much, so.
Well, as I say, I was quite pleased with those new Aston microphones.
Yeah.
They're kind of pre-distressed, so they'll still look the same way in 50 years' time. Yeah, they're pretty rugged. Okay. Any more gear questions? Nobody's going to dare ask about what monitors to use, are they? Okay, well, we're not talking about monitors. I would suggest that if you're going to put your monitors on a shelf, no matter what brand they are, it would be good to have some isolation platforms because they do make a huge difference in the sound. The cheapest things you can get are things like the Mopads, which are just foam, and they make a bit of difference, but they're not as good as they could be unless you go to the garden centre and put a small paving slab on top of them, and then they're actually quite good. Or you can buy the Prime Acoustics ones where they've done the job for you and got some foam and they've put a bit of 1/4-inch armour plating on the top of it, and that sounds quite good. Or best still, you can spend a bit of money and buy the ISO Acoustics ones, which are the things that slot together and they look like, you know, sort of a high school molecule kit. And for some reason they're absolutely fantastic. They really tighten up the bass, they improve the imaging, and they've got little adjustments that you can put in so that you can angle the speakers so that they're actually aiming just behind your head where they should. And it makes such a difference. Put them back on the shelf and they sound like rubbish. So
We actually used 4-pack tins of beans.
yes,
And that worked quite well.
I suppose there's no reason. Any particular flavour of beans?
I think they were Branston beans.
Yeah, okay. I suppose there's a certain amount of damping going on in the cans of beans.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Still in the cellophane wrappers to wrap the four
so
together.
you can sell them again, yeah.
Yeah.
I like you thinking. You're not from Yorkshire, are you?
From Derby, actually.
Well, that's close enough.
Have you ever used egg crates as soundproofing tiles?
They don't actually do much.
No.
They don't do anything for soundproofing, and in terms of sound treatment, the little dips and bumps are so small that they only affect the very, very highest frequency. So you get a bit of diffusion at about 8 or 10 kilohertz maybe, but they're not going to do much below that.
Yeah, I had a friend who like literally put his whole room with egg crates and painted them all black and says, "Oh, have a listen to this like mix I did." It was absolutely terrible. So I just thought, because you're saying about you obviously being a cheap, like trying to not use any money at all and the cheapest possible. I was just wondering if you actually did use egg crates to an advantage, but when my friend used egg crates and put them all around his room.
No, they don't really help, and the other mistake sometimes people make is sticking carpet directly on the walls, which has got the same problem. It only affects the very, very highest frequencies.
Yeah.
It leaves all the boxy ones to roam free, and it actually makes the balance sound even more boxy. So if you've already done that, stick some hard MDF panels on the wall scattered about just to get some high frequency reflection back in, otherwise it's going to sound pretty horrid. But the cheapest full kind of panel size things I've tried rather than acoustic foam, I go down to Wicks, which I believe is having trouble at the moment, aren't they? Wicks is part of Travis Perkins. I read in the paper today they're closing 30 stores, so I hope it's not the one near you. Yeah, so if you go down there, you buy a pack of cavity wall insulation. It comes in 30mm or 50mm, and it's really compressed rock wool, so it's rigid. You can pick up a board of it. It's just like Weetabix or something.
Yeah, we've used rock wool on. Well, we tried to soundproof rehearsal room, but the walls were that thin. It was such an old room that the rock wall just did not do anything.
Yeah,
we had tests. We went down into the street on the. It was like the 3rd floor on the really high
the
building.
reason for that is that there are very different treatments for soundproofing and sound acoustic treatment. The rock wall's there for acoustic treatment, to take the reflections out and to make your room sound better. And these panels work really well if you wrap them in fabric to keep the fibres in, hang that on the wall. You probably only need 2 or 3 square metres in a typical small home studio, and it'll sound a lot better.
Yeah.
And it's fairly inexpensive. But soundproofing, if you've got a thin wall, it's very, very difficult because you have to double the mass of a wall just to get an extra 6 dBs of isolation.
Yeah.
Which is pretty depressing, really.
If we did that, then we'd have no space to
You'd have no
practice
space
at
left
all.
at all. So if it's a plasterboard wall and it resonates, the thing to do is stick another layer of plasterboard on, but use the stuff that they call green glue, which comes out of a mastic gun.
Right.
And it never totally sets, so it's always kind of resilient, and that will give you, a worthwhile improvement, and it'll stop the panels resonating because it damps them. That's quite good. The other thing is to build plinths to put the noise-making gear on. I mean, if it's a guitar amp on the floor, some of the vibration goes straight into the floor. So if you get a piece of that rock wall slab we just talked about again and put a piece of plywood on top of that and then the amp on that, that's going to help to isolate it, and you can make a drum riser the same way.
Yeah.
We did that again for some college that was having problems. We just made this big riser, put the wood on the top of it, put the drum kit on, and it helps. And even something like a V-drum kit can be annoying if you've got neighbours downstairs, because just the mechanical thump of the pedal goes straight through the floor. So make a little drum riser with some rock wool underneath it, and it will just sit on top. The rock wool is so rigid that it won't compress much, and it will keep a lot of the sound out. And then, of course, the other weak spot, doors and windows. If it's not airtight, if you can still breathe in that room after 2 hours, it's not soundproof.
Yeah.
So double glazed doors with proper seals, ones that compress and close. There is no cheap solution to soundproofing, unfortunately.
No.
I've had people come and say, well, we need a cheap solution because I've only got cheap equipment. It's like, well, it makes the same noise as expensive equipment, so the solution's the same, unfortunately.
Which takes me to Acoustic Tiles.
Yes.
You can get cheap ones and you can get really expensive ones.
Yes.
Is the difference worth the difference?
I say the more expensive ones don't tend to perform that much better. If it's a foam one, certainly it's down to the thickness of the foam and the density of it, and a little bit to the surface profile. If the profile's too deep, it reduces the average depth and it's not quite so effective. I think the more expensive ones look prettier, and sometimes they'll put bits of perforated MDF on the front and paint it nice colours. I'm not convinced that it's actually any better than going down to Wicks and buying a piece of rock wool.
Right.
And if you can space any of this stuff away from the wall, it'll actually work down to a lower frequency. So if you've got a piece of acoustic foam, stick 4 or 5 car wash sponges on the back and then glue that on the wall, and it'll space it away far enough to add another octave to its effectiveness, really.
It's more of a personal question. Of like, do you have your own studio? Of course, you must have.
Yes, but it's only a smallish one.
Yeah. Do you tend to use like mood lighting or any kind of like some like things that you tend to enjoy having in your studio?
You want to see my place? See my studio. The lighting's fairly conventional, but the ceiling's decorated with all these things you tend to find in hippie shops, because we have a load of hippies where we live.
Right.
And it makes them feel at home. So we've got stuffed fish and elves and Buzz Lightyear and whatever, and they all. I've got this big stuffed lizard on top of one of my speakers. I call it the monitor lizard, which is quite nice.
Well, I tend to perform better. Because I'm a singer and a guitarist, but whenever I'm doing any vocal work, I prefer to sing and perform in a much more darker, dimmed light lit room.
Yeah.
It brings out more emotion in my voice and stuff like that.
That's always true. You've got to make singers comfortable. And that's the other point. If the singer complains about the headphone mix, don't think they're being awkward. They'll sing a lot better if they're happy with the headphone mix. So spend the time getting the balance right, the level right, and putting a bit of reverb in to keep them happy. And whatever you do, never tell a singer they've done a bad take. You just tell them you think they've got a better one in them.
Well done, Cash. Yeah, that's what you do.
Because otherwise the ego just crashes and it all goes horribly wrong. So you've got to use a lot of psychology in getting the best out of people, and not to push them too hard. Record lots of takes of things, and just try and be relaxed about the whole thing. And it works so well. Mood lighting is good if you can get it. Water to drink, but not too cold, because that closes up the throat as well.
Yeah.
You know. No drugs.
No, of course not.
Yes, of course not. Yes, he says. Well, unless you're doing techno, in which case, of course, you've got to.
No, no. I don't really have anything else other than to say how do you feel when you actually record a band? Do you enjoy having bands in that are like different kind of music? Do you use different production techniques if you use different bands? If
you treat the music for whatever it is, and if the music's well played, I don't care, you know, whether it's a folk band with a banjo and a concertina or whether it's somebody doing dance music, you know. I'm quite happy to engineer music that I would never probably listen to through choice, because I'm kind of into getting the best possible result out of it. And you just give the music what it needs. And if it's well played acoustic music, that's usually just balancing and a little tiny bit of ambience treatment, maybe gentle compression, gentle EQ, nothing too radical. And yet if it's something a lot more rocky, then pretty much anything goes. I enjoy working with any kind of music as long as it's well played. What I don't like is the guy who turns up with the rusty guitar strings with 12.5 semitones to the octave because he's never heard the word intonation. And there's I've got this kind of David Gilmour sound in my head, and he hasn't got it in his fingers or in his guitar. I've had a couple of those where people, you know what kids sound like in the music shop when they're trying their first guitar? Well, I've had a couple of people come in, they play like that, and it's like, don't do this to me. Sometimes I've had to play it for them, but that's bad for their ego as well, so you have to try and let them do it if you can. So pick good musicians and make excuses if bad people come. That's
What's your worst experience of recording? One of these guys.
not worst, but the most arduous one.
Yeah.
Okay. I did. This was probably 20 odd years ago. I was doing a recording with Gordon Giltrap, the guitar player, and Rick Sanders, who was the fiddle player with Fairport Convention. I think he still is, and they're both excellent musicians. And Gordon is very laid back and plays his guitar parts perfectly in about 2 takes. And then we were doing it on analog tape then, which is why I hate the stuff now. And Rick would play about 4 bars, and then he'd say, "Oh, can you drop me in after the second bar?" No, I didn't like that. "Can you drop me in after the second bar?" "No." "Can you drop me in after the second bar?" And then he'd play back and go, "That's okay, but I didn't like bar 4. Can I now do bar 4? So he spent 3 weeks doing his bloody fiddle parts, and everyone sounded perfect in the first place anyway. I don't know what was wrong with it. And then they went on tour and did, I think, was it 40 gigs in 41 days, and I think the two of them only just started speaking to each other again now. But it was an enjoyable end result, but it was really hard work doing it, especially with tape, because people forget about analog tape. There was no undo button. You had to time your punch-ins, and if you missed it, you had to go back and re-record the previous bar, and you might have been happy with that. The talent's allowed to make as many mistakes as they like, but if you cock up one punch-in, it's your fault. So the undo button is the best invention of the last 30 years, I would say. We just want one for life now. Any more? We've still got a few minutes before the curry becomes overwhelmingly attractive and we have to leave you, so you've got time for a couple more questions if you want.
Actually, yeah. Who's your favourite producer?
It's really hard to know. It depends what they're producing. I mean, I like the stuff that Alan Parsons did back in the day because it was very straightforward and he limited the use of compression. He didn't like using it just for the sake of it. He used it when it was actually needed. Dark Side of the Moon had virtually no compression on, certainly very little on the drums. So I kind of like that old school stuff.
Okay.
And then you get more left field people like Daniel Lanois who do a few weirdy things, and that's always good too. Butch Vig is good. I think Yeah, anyone who can sell records is a good producer, really. Half of the job is just stopping the bass player killing the drummer, really. That's half of what the producer does, isn't it? Make sure that no one brings in drugs and that enough sandwiches come in.
Yeah.
It's being a people person. I mean, joking aside, that is underrated, the people person side of it. It's just massaging those egos and getting the best out of people, and just kind of steering things rather than barging in and saying, no, you're doing it my way. The technology you can almost take for granted these days. It's about having a good musical head and handling people. Anyone in the back row hasn't asked anything?
Alan Parsons had a series, I think, of videos not that long ago.
Yes.
Remember them?
Yes.
What do you think of them? I thought they were great.
They're good, but we were discussing it on the way down, and the trouble with all these lovely workshops that people do is that they always get a really good band in, so you don't have to fix many of the problems that we actually have to deal with when you're dealing with real bands, which are it's like the over-distorted guitar, the guy who's just won't turn his overdrive down or off, plays legato chords all the way through and sounds like someone slicing up a frozen badger with a chainsaw, you know, the kind of thing. They're really difficult to deal with. So then you've got to learn various techniques, like trying to filter things very carefully so they don't stump over each other, which is where a good musical arranger comes in, and which is what a lot of young bands don't have, because they'll play the same way they play on stage. And while the excitement might carry them through on stage, it sometimes sounds really messy in the studio. So you might have to go in and suggest, could you play that with a bit less dirt and maybe a bit of compression? We can dirty it up later if you need it, that kind of thing. And all the other little tricks. So it comes back to being a people person again. Which is why I'm not going to do this for a living. Because we all know the difference between a recording engineer and a toilet seat, don't we? No, toilet seat only has to deal with one arsehole at a time. Okay. Well, if we're all done, I'll be outside for a bit for anyone who was too embarrassed to ask a question earlier, so you can kind of sneak up, finish off the nibbles and drinks, and then we'll see you later. No sniggering in the cheap seats. So thanks ever so much for coming, and thanks for this one.